About 9 or 10 years ago, I was involved as a leader of a Bible study group for kids aged about 12 to 14. It was a voluntary group. It wasn't the sort of thing, that your parents make you go to. And the caliber of child that we got was someone who was very well behaved, what you would call a good person. And there was a very noticeable difference in atmosphere at this meeting from what it's like in general with children of that age group. And it made me think at the time, it's because they're Christians. It's because of the power of the gospel. But then, of course, a little bit later, I removed Christianity from my life because it's a very bad influence. At least that's one of the reasons. And it always kind of bothered me a little bit about that meeting, about those kids and about how good they were. If Christianity is false, why are these kids so darn good? I didn't lose any sleep over it, but it's just one of those things. I mean, it's a little bit of a contradiction, isn't it? Christianity didn't work for me, that's for sure. But am I in the wrong here? I started to understand this better sometime later when I started to appreciate the difference between goodness and compliancy. Compliancy can masquerade as goodness, as long as the authority to which you are being compliant is a benevolent authority. Your parents, your school, your Bible, this sort of thing. The watchword of Christianity is obedience, isn't it? But compliancy and goodness are not the same thing. Because if the authority changes, then you're going to be, if it's a malevolent authority or an authority that demands malevolent action from you and you're a compliant person, then you're just going to go along with it. And the case in point might be something like Nazi Germany. But I don't really want to use such a dramatic example. I want to think more of just the general run of our lives. I mean, when I removed Christianity from my life, there was a difficult period of adjustment as I dealt with the people from that Christian subculture that I had been an intimate part of. And it cost me around 4 relationships. And it was hard. I can remember sitting in the house of this man and woman who were dear friends of mine for many, many years. And the man was angry and was saying, if you follow through with this, we can no longer accept you in our home. A compliant person would cave into that, would say, okay, I've made a mistake. But I recognized that going along with that was wrong. I had a deep conviction that there was something badly wrong with Christianity. And I was following a course that seemed right to me. And to be honest, I've never looked back. And it cost me those relationships. And it was hard. But that also was a test of who I was. And I'm not saying that in every circumstance I've always chosen the right thing over the compliant thing. But I hope, that is some measure of who I am. And believe me, I don't like conflict. Sometimes it can seem as if I do like conflict because I'm such an outspoken critic of Christianity. But that's more of there's a passion in me because I can recognize the harm that was done to me through it. And I think there are people who appreciate a helping hand at a time of confusion, So I want to be there for people like that, however much it offends people who call themselves Christians. So it is what it is. But compliancy, yeah. If you find yourself thinking, there's a good Christian man or there's a good Christian woman, how do you know that? When Christianity is all about obedience, and obedience is all about compliancy, and compliancy does not always equate to goodness. It has to be tested. And I do remember one particular relationship that fell, not because the guy wanted it to, not because the guy had anything particular against me, but it seems to me as if he was just going with the flow of what he thought was expected of him from his own family and how they reacted to me. I considered him a good friend. He hasn't been a part of my life for 8 years. Maybe he's watching, who knows? Most people have an inflated sense of their own goodness, Christian or otherwise. There was an experiment done in the 1960s by a psychologist called Stanley Milgram. This was dramatized in a movie called The Experimenter, which I recommend you watch if you're interested in this sort of thing. I saw it recently, which is kind of what prompted this video. And his experiment involved taking two people from the public who were willing to be paid to take part in an experiment. One of them would play the part of the teacher. The other one would play the part of the student. They would be put in separate rooms, and the teacher would have a machine in front of him that is able to deliver electric shocks to the person in the other room, answering the questions to the student. So in the beginning, the shocks are supposed to be mild, and then the voltage increases with each wrong answer. So there's a microphone, and the teacher asks the first question, and maybe the guy gets it right, maybe he gets it wrong. We go on to the next question. But the first shock is delivered with the first wrong answer, and then he has to turn the voltage up a wee bit, and on the experiment goes, and there's lots of questions. So eventually the teacher, the one playing the teacher role, starts hearing signs of distress coming from the next room. Now remember, the student has no microphone. Only the teacher has the microphone. The student is responding to his questions in a multiple choice fashion by pressing a button, and that lights up a certain thing on the teacher's side, determining whether the answer was right or wrong. A, B, C, or D, that sort of thing. I think I'm remembering this correctly. If I've got some of these details wrong, don't worry, I'm getting the general gist of the experiment right. So after a while, there's a few yelps coming from the next room as the voltage is causing quite a bit of pain. The teacher eventually turns around to the doctor who's taking notes behind him and says, "Should we maybe stop this? I mean, the guy's in a bit of distress here." The doctor calmly says, no, it's essential that we continue to the end of the experiment. Please up the voltage and ask the next question. So the guy continues. Then after a while, he can hear coming from the next room, "Let me out of here! I don't want to be a part of this! Let me out of here!" He turns around to the doctor again and says, "Should we stop the experiment? I mean, the guy's obviously doesn't want to be doing this." The doctor calmly says, "It's essential that we continue to the very end. Please up the voltage. Please ask the next question." Now, in our idealized view of ourselves, we think that we would turn around to the doctor and say, "No, forget this. I'm not going to be a part of this. I'm walking out of here." I forgot to say that at the beginning of the experiment, both parties were paid, and they were specifically told that you've been paid, and regardless of what happens in this experiment, that money is yours. So the guy knows he's free to walk out of here. He can take his money and walk out in righteous indignation. But it's only an exceptional person that actually does that. Most people ended up going right to the end of the experiment, where the voltage had been increased to dangerous levels, according to the labels put on the machine. They just did what they were told by the doctor, even though they expressed, some resistance to it. They always, not always, but they usually caved in and went ahead with it. Kind of like just following orders. Now, the interesting thing about the experiment, and you may have suspected this already, is that the person playing the role of the student is actually not a true participant. He's actually one of the people conducting the experiment. There's only one person being observed here, and that's the one playing the teacher role. The student is not being electrocuted. He's putting on an act. So, when it's all over, the doctor fesses up and tells the teacher that this was all to do with, observing you. Stanley Milgram asks some questions then of the person delivering the shocks and says, "Why did you continue right to the end? Why did you not stop?" And he says, the doctor said I had to keep going." And then he would be asked, "Why did you think the doctor was more important than the person who was being electrocuted, who was giving you obvious signs of distress?" Because people did it because they were compliant to authority. And the experiment was really alarming because it allowed us to see how easily we are manipulated into just going with the flow of what's expected of us from an authority figure. And our lives are full of authorities. There are religious authorities, social authorities, parental authority. And there's nothing wrong with authority. All through nature there's a stratification process where there is, not everything is equal in that way in nature. So it's fine that authorities do exist. But this illustrates that there is a great deal of virtue, is that the right word? Virtue in rebellion against authority, in the right context, of course. It's funny how the word rebellion is normally associated with negativity. A rebel, a bad person, outlaw. Sometimes that is the case, of course. But compliancy, I think can be just as much of an evil as rebellion. We all have to recognize our own complete autonomy as a creature. We don't get to say, I was just following orders. That's a weakness to say that. You're a living, breathing, talking, thinking, unique expression of the universe. And you're entirely in charge of your own life. And any obedience that you give to an authority is precisely that. It's obedience that you give. And it's all well and good to do it. I mean, I go to my job and I fulfill the duties that are required of me in order to keep that job and get paid. But I suppose there could come a circumstance where I would have to say, I'm not going to do that. That's not right. And I hope I would have the stones to make that stand in that particular context. So, I guess my only point is there is sometimes virtue in rebellion, and understand that goodness and compliancy are not the same thing. So when you see goodness in other people, try to figure out whether it's just compliancy in disguise. And also watch out for those events in your own life, because life will throw you these things occasionally where rebellion is required of you, where you know that doing the right thing involves going against the flow. Take care, folks.